Welcome back to Double Helix and the final chapter in our journey through the American Civil War. Today, we're closing the book on this series, and I'll be upfront. It's not a happy ending. I've titled this episode Pyrrhic Victory, and if you're thinking that sounds a little ominous, well, it is. Let me explain. A Pyrrhic victory, named after King Pyrrhus of Epirus, refers to a win so costly that it almost feels like a defeat. Pyrrhus won a battle in ancient Greece, but the losses he sustained were so heavy that his victory nearly destroyed him. And honestly, there's no better way to describe what happens after the Civil War. The Union came out on top, but at such a tremendous cost that the victory felt hollow. And what followed, the chaotic, painful period of Reconstruction, was, in many ways, a tragedy of its own. So, that's where we're headed today. We'll look at how the Union's triumph turned into something much darker, how the assassination of Abraham Lincoln shattered the fragile hope of unity, and how President Andrew Johnson, well, let's just say he was no Lincoln. Johnson's failure opened the doors to the South to cling to its old ways, disguised as something they called the lost cause. We'll also dive into the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the brutal enforcement of black codes, and the birth of Jim Crow laws. It's a pretty bleak picture, but it's the reality of a victory that was being undone, piece by piece, on the streets of the South and in the halls of government. History isn't just about battles and big names. It's about the choices people make, about the direction societies take when faced with crossroads. The Civil War ended in 1865, but what we'll talk about today, that legacy, both its triumphs and its failures, still shapes the world we live in. So, buckle up and jump in with me into part 11 of our Civil War series, Pyrrhic Victory. Welcome to Double Helix, Blueprint of Nations, Season 2, Episode 2.11, Pyrrhic Victory. Let's rewind to April 14, 1865. The country was still reeling from the cost of the war. There was at least a sense that the bloodshed might finally stop. And then, out of nowhere, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. Just days after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, the man who had held the Union together was suddenly gone, and the hope for a peaceful and just Reconstruction was out the window too. Lincoln wasn't perfect. We've established that. He had his flaws like anyone else, but he had vision. He had this idea of reconciliation, of rebuilding the nation with some level of mercy. But with him gone, everything changed, and into the void stepped Andrew Johnson. Now, Johnson's a complicated figure. He was a Southern Democrat who stayed loyal to the Union. Let's just say his loyalties to racial equality were non-existent. His approach to Reconstruction was a disaster. Johnson's leniency towards the South was downright alarming. He granted pardons left and right, let former Confederates slide back into positions of power, and worst of all, he allowed the South to start enacting laws that were basically designed to keep black people from fully enjoying their freedom. These laws were known as black codes, and they were a slap in the face to everything the Union had supposedly fought for. Imagine being a newly freed, former enslaved person after generations of enslavement, only to find that your freedom came with strings attached, strings that were looking an awful lot like chains. The black codes varied from place to place, but the message was the same. Sure, slavery was over, but white supremacy wasn't going anywhere. Now, these black codes, wow, they were something else. In some states, black people weren't allowed to own land. In others, they couldn't gather in groups without a white person present. And if you didn't have a job, you could be arrested for vagrancy and forced into labor. Basically, a legal loophole to drag you back into something that felt a lot like slavery. The point was clear. Emancipation might have been written into law, but the South was determined to hold on to its old order. And this wasn't just happening in a vacuum. Andrew Johnson was sitting back, allowing this nightmare to unfold. He wasn't just ineffective. He was actively sympathetic to the Southern cause, letting former Confederates take their seats in Congress like nothing had ever happened. It's hard to overstate just how badly Johnson fumbled this moment. Reconstruction should have been about rebuilding a better country, one that lived up to the ideals that the war was fought over. But instead, it quickly turned into a bitter struggle to maintain white supremacy. Meanwhile, Congress wasn't blind to what was going on. There was a faction known as the Radical Republicans, led by men like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. You remember him from the canning. They had a much more transformative vision for Reconstruction. They saw Johnson for what he was, a roadblock to real progress. These guys wanted more than just a reunited Union. They wanted to reshape the South, to break the power of the old plantation elite, and to make good on the promise of freedom for African Americans. But Johnson's lenient policies were doing the exact opposite. So, as you can imagine, things were about to get ugly. Congress and Johnson were on a collision course, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Johnson's approach allowed former Confederates to regain power and start spinning this narrative that would later become the lost cause, an idea that painted the South as noble warriors fighting for states' rights, not for the preservation of slavery. The seeds of that myth were already being sown, and it would take root in ways that would haunt the nation for decades. But if Johnson was opening the door for the old guard to sneak back in, another door was swinging wide open too, one to a much darker chapter. This is where we meet the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan didn't just spring up overnight. But by 1866, the secret society of white supremacists was spreading like wildfire. The Klan made it their mission to destroy Reconstruction through terror. And I'm not using terror lightly here. They burned homes, they lynched men, and they committed horrific acts of violence to send a clear message. African Americans might be legally free, but we'll never let you be truly equal in our society. Wearing their white hoods to hide their identities, Klan members would sweep through black communities in the dead of night, leaving devastation in their wake. And it wasn't just black people who were their targets. If you were a white Southerner who supported Reconstruction, or even worse, a carpetbagger from the North who had come south to help rebuild, you were on their list too. This wasn't random violence. It was organized, deliberate, and terrifyingly effective. In many places, black voters were too scared to show up at the polls. And when you have a group like the Ku Klux Klan terrorizing entire communities, it doesn't take long before that fear starts dismantling the political gains made during Reconstruction. The Klan wasn't just about violence for violence sake. They were on a mission to crush the fragile coalition forming between African Americans and radical Republicans. They wanted to make sure the South stayed under the control of white supremacists, even if that meant it's a tool to keep black people from voting, holding office, or even existing freely in their communities. By the late 1860s, Congress finally took notice. The violence had reached such terrifying levels that they couldn't ignore it anymore. And so they passed the Enforcement Acts, also known as the Ku Klux Klan Acts, in 1870 and 1871. These laws were designed to give the federal government the power to step in, send federal troops, and protect African Americans from terror being unleashed on them. But, and here's the kicker, the damage was already done. The Klan had succeeded in many of their goals by the time these laws came into effect. Black communities had been beaten down, scared into silence, and the dreams of a truly reconstructed South were starting to crumble. Sure, the federal government cracked down on the Klan for a while, but the deep scars left behind were permanent. The terror might have subsided for the moment, but the structures of white supremacy were already starting to take root again, and they were stronger than ever. This brings us to one of the biggest tragedies of the Reconstruction period. Despite the North's military victory, the South managed to win the peace in many ways. And by the time Reconstruction officially ended in 1877, the South had found legal ways to ensure that African Americans remained second-class citizens. Let's talk about Jim Crow laws, which you've probably heard of from my companions. These laws were designed to undermine the social, economic, and political freedoms of African Americans, creating a new form of servitude in a supposedly free society. The Black Codes were an early attempt to reinstate white supremacy immediately after the war, but the Jim Crow laws, beginning in the 1890s, would entrench racial segregation for decades to come. Under these laws, schools, transportation, restaurants, and even cemeteries were segregated by race. And while the Supreme Court would famously declare the system separate but equal, the reality was that facilities for Black people were anything but equal. One of the most effective tools for keeping African Americans out of the political process was the poll tax, a fee that voters were required to pay in order to cast a ballot. While this tax technically applied to everyone, it was deliberately set at a level that many African Americans couldn't afford, effectively barring them from the polls. There were also literacy tests, requiring voters to demonstrate reading skills. But these tests were rigged. They were designed to fail African Americans and often didn't apply to white voters. In fact, in many states, the grandfather clause allowed white people to skip these tests if their grandfathers had voted before the Civil War, meaning almost all African Americans were excluded. These laws worked exactly as intended. By the turn of the 20th century, African American voter participation in the South had plummeted. In Louisiana, for example, Black voter registrations fell from 130,000 in 1896 to just over 1,300 by 1904, a staggering 99% drop. The gains of Reconstruction were systematically dismantled, and Black Americans were left with little more than the illusion of freedom. I'll pause here for a moment, because this is where the myth of the lost cause really starts to take hold. In the years after the war, Southern leaders, writers, and intellectuals began crafting a narrative that recast the Confederacy not as a failed rebellion, but as a noble cause fought for by honorable men. This revisionist history downplayed or outright ignored slavery's central role in the conflict, focusing instead on states' rights, Southern honor, and the valor of Confederate soldiers. The lost cause found fertile ground in the South devastated by war, economically destroyed, and humiliated by defeat. For many white Southerners, the idea that their ancestors had fought for a noble cause rather than for the preservation of slavery was a comforting balm to the wounds of a loss. This narrative allowed them to maintain a sense of pride, even in defeat. One of the earliest proponents of the lost cause was Edward A. Pollard, a journalist from Virginia who published The Lost Cause, a New Southern History of the War of the Confederates in 1866. In it, he argued that the Confederacy hadn't fought to preserve slavery, but rather to defend states' rights and the Southern way of life. Pollard downplayed the moral failures of the Confederacy and instead portrayed the Southern defeat as a tragic consequence of the overwhelming Northern industrial power. The idea of the lost cause was picked up and amplified by former Confederate generals like Jubal Early or John B. Gordon, who gave speeches glorifying the Confederate cause and lionizing its leaders, especially Robert E. Lee. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, or the UDC, founded in 1894, became one of the driving forces behind the spread of the lost cause ideology. The UDC played a massive role in shaping how the Civil War was remembered, not just in the South, but across the country. The UDC funded the erection of Confederate monuments, established historical societies, and promoted textbooks that offered a sanitized version of Southern history. The monuments, statues, and plaques honoring Confederate generals weren't just tributes to history. They were strategic pieces of propaganda. They were erected during the late 19th and early 20th century, just as Jim Crow laws were taking hold in the South. These statues weren't commemorating the immediate aftermath of the Civil War or helping us remember history. They were celebrating a revisionist history that was designed to maintain the racial hierarchy established during slavery. One of the most enduring pieces of the lost cause propaganda was Margaret Mitchell's 1936 novel, Gone with the Wind. I'm sure you've heard of the movie. The story romanticizes the antebellum South, portraying it as a land of chivalry and grace, tragically destroyed by Northern aggression. The slaves in the story are depicted as loyal and content, a far cry from the brutal reality of their lives. Gone with the Wind became a cultural phenomenon and cemented the lost cause mythology in the American imagination. This revisionist history didn't just influence the South. The lost cause narrative made its way into textbooks across the country, teaching generations of Americans a distorted version of the Civil War. By shifting the focus away from slavery and reframing the war as a noble struggle for Southern rights, the lost cause allowed the country to avoid confronting the deep-seated racism that had fueled the conflict to begin with. The Confederate monuments that sprang up in town squares, courthouse lawns, and public parks weren't just symbols of the past. They were declarations of who held power in the present, and they sent a clear message to African Americans. Even in defeat, the South had maintained control over the narrative and, by extension, over society. Now, fast forward to the end of Reconstruction in 1877. By this point, it was painfully clear that the North had lost interest in the project of rebuilding the South. The federal government, exhausted by years of conflict, was ready to wash its hands of Reconstruction. The last Union troops were withdrawn from southern states, and with them went the last real protections for African Americans. And here's a tragic paradox. On paper, the South lost the war. The Confederacy was defeated, slavery was abolished, and the Union was preserved. But in reality, the South had managed to win the peace, at least in terms of social and racial hierarchy. Jim Crow laws solidified segregation, and the myth of the lost cause dominated the national memory of the Civil War. The promise of Reconstruction, of freedom and equality for all, was crushed under the weight of white supremacy. The federal government, after initially enforcing Reconstruction with the might of the Union Army, eventually turned its back on African Americans, leaving them to fend for themselves in a hostile, often violent environment. The South had found ways to preserve much of its pre-war social order, albeit without the institution of slavery. Sharecropping and convict leasing replaced slavery, locking many African Americans into poverty and forced labor. The brief period of African American political and social advancement during Reconstruction was fully reversed, and the hard-won rights that had been paid for in blood were systematically stripped away. The Civil War was supposed to be a turning point, a moment when the ideals of liberty and equality would finally be realized. And yet, as the dust settled and the nation began to rebuild, it became clear that the old systems of oppression hadn't just been dismantled, they had only been reshaped. It is hard not to feel a sense of bitterness when reflecting on the aftermath of the Civil War. So much blood was spilled, so many lives were lost, and yet, in the end, the fight for true freedom and equality was postponed for generations. It would take another 100 years of struggle, through the civil rights movement, through the efforts of countless activists, to begin undoing the damage done during this period. And even today, we're still dealing with the echoes of that unfinished work. I know I am ending on a bit of a sour note here, but after reflecting on the Civil War and the immense cost it exacted, more than 600,000 lives, countless homes and families torn apart, The very fabric of the nation nearly unraveled. It's impossible not to grapple with the bitter truth. Despite the Union's victory, despite the end of slavery, it took another century, an entire century, before Black Americans could begin to secure the rights that so many had sacrificed their lives for. It was as if, in the wake of all the devastation, the will to fight for the final mile, true equality, had been lost. So, as we bring the series to a close, it's impossible to ignore the unsettling paradox that defines the legacy of the U.S. Civil War. The Confederacy lost the battle, but in many ways, they won the war for control over the narrative, and in some cases, the systems of power. The hard-won victories of the battlefield were eroded by policies, laws, and cultural memory that allowed white supremacy to remain dominant. After all the sacrifice, after all the death and destruction, we're left with this haunting question. Was it all for nothing? Did the Civil War resolve the issues it was fought over, or did it merely set the stage for another century of struggle? The war may have ended slavery, but didn't end the systems that had supported it. The battle for civil rights, for true equality, is still being fought for today, in courtrooms, in schools, in the very heart of American society. I want to thank you for joining me on this journey through the American Civil War and its aftermath. You can find this show anywhere you get your podcasts. We are also on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Just search for Double Helix and you'll see our podcast slowly making its way up there. Please rate us because it helps others find the podcast. And finally, a huge shout out to the people of Colombia. Yes, the Colombian series has been a hit there, and I am hoping I was able to do your country justice. Next time, on Double Helix, we'll explore another pivotal chapter in the history of civil wars. We are going to travel to Spain, where we'll study the Spanish Civil War. Until then, thank you for listening, and we will see you soon.